Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today's video is going to be a little video about how I made this cassowary doll. So this is an Australian cassowary. It's modelled off obviously the Australian version, but you can also find cassowaries in Papua New Guinea, which is really interesting. I'm considering doing the other cassowaries because I really enjoyed creating this one, and I liked the little challenge that it gave to me to do something completely different, which is, you know, doing things with different materials for the neck and also the leg area. So it was quite fun to do. So here's a little look at his face. He's got a quite stern little face, and I also added the little detailings up here to make it blend in a bit nicer to the body. This fur was in my mouth. Oh my god. Yeah, this fur was really great. I think it looks really realistic for a cassowary feathers, I guess you could call it. But I even added little things like the wings here, which are kind of important to the cassowary, you know. So I'll talk about how I did those as well, and a little look at the legs, or the detailing on the legs if it will focus. But I think, yeah, I think I'm really happy with the way this turned out. It's enabled me to do, you know, different types of animals and different type of ideas, so, and explore different types of yeah, artistic freedom, I guess. But yeah, anyway, so this one has been for sale in my shop on Patreon. So if it hasn't already been snapped up, it'll now be in my public shop on creaturesandart.com. And yeah, just remember, if you want early access to any of my work that I make, have a look at my Patreon. Any tier gets that early access and that link to my shop section. So basically you get that link and a password specific to that that particular doll, or launch I should say. So the password's different every time, but yeah, so really happy with the way this turned out. And if you want to watch how I made him, then keep watching. And I also must mention that I have a couple of videos over on my Patreon as well, talking about just a little bit more extra detailing about what I did in the process of making this one. So I kind of plan to do that more with each doll that I make, is to do like a separate Patreon videos, just talking about the process a little bit more. So yeah, so if anybody wants a little bit more than just the YouTube, then yeah, you can find it over on my Patreon. Anyway, if you want to know how I made him, keep watching. Alrighty, so if you haven't already seen my videos on sculpting the parts for this cassowary doll, definitely check it out. I'll try and remember to link it down below, but it is on my channel. And I go through the whole process of how I sculpted the head, and I also go through the process of how I sculpted the feet. You can find specific tutorials on how I created the plates on top that you can see here, and also the smaller scales that you will see throughout the bottom of the foot. And also over on my Patreon, I have 2 videos going into detail about bits and pieces of the process putting it together, so a little bit more that you would normally find on my YouTube channel. So explain the process of how I did the armature, how I did the felting, what I did on the neck, and just the overall process, and little extra bits and pieces on my Patreon. So I am trying to do that for every doll that I am making. It's just a little bit more for my patrons that want a little bit more, where I just talk about the process of making the actual doll. So I don't know how many videos I'll do, but for each doll, but definitely trying to do at least one video for each doll. So moving on with the actual cassowary. So after I've sculpted it, I usually prime my pieces before I do anything. So I prime it with a canvas primer, and it's by the brand Matisse, and it just makes a nice tooth on the surface so the paint has something to stick to. And then I'm going ahead and painting all of the surfaces with water-based acrylic paints, usually with that brand Chromacryl. It's an Australian brand, but you can find any cheapy sort of craft acrylic paints, and they work fine. So I'm basically mixing up the blues on the surface and then sort of blending them in with each other. I have reference images up on my computer next to me to make sure I have the painting correct and all of the markings applied correctly. And yeah, just going through that whole process. But before I painted, I added that armature into the head and also the feet. I decided to sort of change the armature halfway through, but I explained that more in that Patreon video that I've uploaded over there. And so I've given the head a couple of layers of paint. The crest I gave 2 layers of that brown paint, and then I can go in and add like the little detailings, like the edges and all of the flaking and stuff like that. So I just want to basically get the painting, like a base coat of the paint down to begin with, and then once the doll is put together, I can go ahead and start adding like little finer details and little patterns or anything like that that needs to be added. So this cassowary that I'm making is an Australian cassowary. There's other cassowaries found, but this one is in Australia. I think the other ones are in Papua New Guinea. And they look a little different, so I'd be interested to see maybe I could make them in the future. But because I'm Australian, I obviously decided to make the Australian cassowary. So yeah, so this is what we got. So basically what I'm doing now is adding those little flaky details that you see on the crests of the cassowary. So the crests are all sort of different, and I sort of made this one to fold over to the one side, but you can have longer ones, straight ones, smaller ones, but yeah, I decided to add this one specifically to have it sort of leaning over to the one side, just give it a little bit of character. Then I'm going in with the white paint and just creating like a little bit of flaking around those areas that I painted in, just to give them a bit more of a dimension. And then I sort of muted them down by pressing on the paint because I didn't want it that white. So yeah, I just muted it down by pressing some of that paint off. For the feet, it's relatively similar, just a bit of a different process with the painting. So what I'm doing is applying a black base coat, and then I'll be going over with a grey, like a grey kind of wash or dry brush technique. And that basically means all of the detailing in the scales will be left black, and all of the raised details will become grey. So I did a couple of little studies on their feet, like what colours I wanted to do, and they range in different colours. Some are more like a yellowy colour, which I did add a little bit of yellow to this, but I went for the grey look to it because I just kind of liked the grey look, I guess. But yeah, it's really up to you what colour you want to make your cassowary feet, but I think the dry brush technique worked really well. With this, I wasn't too happy with the amount of yellow that was on there, so I went over it again with the grey and sort of muted it once again to get rid of that yellowing. So moving on to the body, so like I said, that whole armature talk and everything else will be in those Patreon videos, but the basic process is just a needle felting process to create that body and a rough sort of base for the skin to go over. But I have heaps of videos on my Patreon on how I did this with other dolls as well, so head over there and you can find a lot of tutorials over there. So it took a little while to do the felting for this body, but I wanted to get the muscling right before I start adding that skin. And I think that really helps with creating like that leg patterning when I've put that skin over the top. So basically what I'm doing now is working on the legs before. I wanted to get the fabric pieces down before I actually put the faux fur on top. So what I'm using is like a cotton fabric and this will act as like the reptile like skin that you find on the cassowary. It's also the same as for the neck area. And I just sewed it up at the back using a lattice stitch and then proceeded to glue the end onto the polymer clay piece. And I sort of blended that in a little bit more than I normally would. So I wanted that glue to sort of seep through and create more of a bonded look to it, and then once I applied the paint over the top of it, I wanted it to blend in a bit better, so you couldn't really tell that there was a seam line there, which I think it worked really well, because when I applied all the detailings with the scales, it sort of blended it in really nicely, and yeah, it worked really well, so I'm quite happy with the way it turned out. So I'm using a white fabric because I wanted to apply that paint to it to be able to create sort of, I guess, an illusion of texture and scaling. So I wanted to create my own colours for it as well. So the same deal with the neck. I sewed it up with a ladder stitch using the felting as a guide to what I wanted it to look like. And just gluing that little neck piece onto the head using that same technique, and sort of kind of saturating the end of it with the glue so I can blend it in a little bit better to the polymer clay. And then once that's done, I can start moving ahead with the next steps. So for the little wrinkly details on the neck of the cassowary, so the kind of the red part of the cassowary, I decided to use this lightweight air dry clay. It's kind of like a foamy clay, and it's super, super light and a little bit flexible. So I thought this would be really good to use as the wrinkly part because it's really wrinkly with this little bit. So I thought I'd sculpt it on. And this clay I got off, Miniature Sweet website, I think it was. And it's really, really good for really lightweight things because I didn't want to weigh the front of the cassowary down. So time for the painting of all of those bits. So I'm just using the chroma quill paint that I used to paint the head, and just applying that grey base coat for the legs, and then going ahead and applying a base coat for the neck area. So I went in with this darker blue colour and obviously the red for the little red bits. And then once the doll was put together, I wanted to do like more of a refining painting once it's all put together, so I can get the bits that are showing. So basically with this skin, I cut out a larger piece of faux fur, roughly the size that I needed to be, but with larger seam lines, so I could sort of trim it up a little bit to make it more conformed to the felting underneath. And I'm going ahead and using a ladder stitch to sew all around. So I started off with sewing the spine bit area, and then trimming everything underneath and sewing all that up with the ladder stitch as well. But I talk about that more in those videos over on my Patreon if you want to know a little bit more. For the little drumstick areas, I'm adding a piece of faux fur onto that little leg bit and just sewing it onto the main body of the cassowary. So it's a smaller piece of fabric that I cut out in like a little cylinder shape or length of fur, and then sewing one end to the body of the faux fur, and then I'll be gluing the other end to the fabric bit of the legs. And I thought that would be a bit more of a smoother transition from faux fur to this little to the fabric. So once that's done and I'm happy with the way everything is sewn up, I can start adding all those little extra details on those fabric pieces. So what I'm using is a watered down acrylic paint, which will be all the little detailing for the scales. So the scales are all different shapes and sizes, and they sort of become smaller once it moves away from those bigger plates. So I decided to paint on those plate scales at the front and also the back area, and then fill in that extra spot, those missing spots, using bigger and smaller dots. And I'm just basically dotting it in, as you can see, all different shapes and sizes. And because it is watered down, it dries really smoothly, and it's not too much of a stark appearance. Whereas if you put just plain black paint on, it would be quite stark. So that's why I used a watered down paint, and it sort of absorbs into the fabric a bit better and makes it a bit more seam line. So yeah, I think using this method really worked to make it a bit more realistic. So for those little wing bits that you see on cassowaries, I had a few ideas of how to do it, and ultimately I just decided to use some feathers, right? So for the feathers, what I did was peeled off, I got these black feathers for starters, and I peeled off the feathering off that spine. And for this one, I left the little tip on, and I eventually just cut it off because I'm going to be using it for a different doll. And it's a secretary bird. So I wanted to reuse these bits because I think they would work really well, and if I was using the whole feather it would make it quite a bit too big for the cassowary. So you can see what it looks like, just the spine area, and it's got like this little, where I pulled the feathering off, it's got like different colors, that's exactly what I wanted in these little spines. So basically what I'm doing is just coating that tip of the spine with some glue and then just sort of forcing it in between the backing of the fabric of the faux fur. And because the faux fur has like a woven backing, you can sort of get it in between those little woven bits. If you're having a bit of trouble, you can always poke it with a needle tool and make that little hole, but I thought just using these, the end of the feather things are sharp enough to push it through. So you can see here I'm just slowly wiggling it in, and it sort of just fit in really nicely. Because there's the glue at the tip of it, it dries really securely to the faux fur, and it won't fall out or move or anything. So once that's done, it's just ready for the final little bits. So you can see I'm just adding those little bit of detailings along the neck area just to bring it to life a bit more and create a bit more dimension with different paints. So that is pretty much it for this video. So this cassowary is up in my shop if you want to check it out and purchase it. Payment plans are also welcome, so just shoot me a message beforehand and we can definitely work something out. But yeah, thanks for voting. I have another vote up on my Patreon for the next doll, so check that out. Thanks very much for my Patreons for voting for this one as well. I really enjoyed doing it, so I hope you enjoyed seeing everything. But yeah, you can also check me out on Instagram and Facebook and my shop, creationsinthenet.com, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!